The year 1881 clung to the air of Cedarwood Manor like a damp, persistent fog. It was a place steeped in history and shadow, nestled deep within the quiet, forgotten corners of Massachusetts. For Clara Monroe, it had been home for all of her 17 years, a grand, imposing structure of dark wood and even darker secrets. Yet, in the spring of that year, something shifted. It began subtly, with the whispering portraits on the walls, the cold drafts that seemed to follow her, and a gnawing sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. Her grandmother, the matriarch of the Monroe family, had passed away 6 months prior. Eleanor Monroe was a woman of fierce will and even fiercer opinions. Her presence had been a physical weight in the house, a constant pressure that defined every aspect of Clara's life. Since her death, Clara had felt a strange, almost liberating emptiness. But that emptiness was now being filled by something else, something she couldn't name. It started with small things. Clara, a girl known for her quiet reserve and meticulous habits, would find herself standing in the drawing room, a half-finished embroidery in her hands, with no memory of having picked it up. Her mother, Beatrice, noticed the change first. "Clara, darling, you look pale. Are you sleeping well?" she'd ask, her voice laced with a concern that was both loving and weary. Clara would nod, a lie forming easily on her lips. "Just tired, Mother." But it was more than fatigue. One afternoon, while sorting through her grandmother's old jewelry box, Clara caught a glimpse of herself in the polished silver surface of a hand mirror. For a fleeting second, the reflection was not her own. A stern, disapproving gaze, a tight-lipped scowl she knew so well, stared back at her. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the jolt of fear it sent through her was real. She dropped the mirror, the clatter echoing in the silent room. Later that week, during a dinner with the family's old friends, Clara's father, Richard, asked her a simple question about her studies. She opened her mouth to reply, but the words that came out were not hers. They were sharp, critical, and delivered with a tone that was eerily familiar. "Richard, you should have paid more attention to the family's finances. This is hardly a suitable topic for dinner conversation." A stunned silence fell over the table. Her father's face, usually jovial and kind, turned to a mask of confusion. The words, so clearly Eleanor's, hung in the air. Clara felt a hot blush creep up her neck, her hands trembling. She stammered an apology, claiming a sudden headache, and retreated to her room. The incidents grew more frequent. Clara's posture, once soft and unassuming, became rigid. Her movements, once graceful, were now deliberate and authoritative. She began to use phrases that were her grandmother's trademarks, from "for goodness sake" to the withering stare that could silence a room. She found herself rearranging furniture in the drawing room to her grandmother's preferred layout, and even critiquing the cook's dishes in the same biting manner. One evening, her mother found her in her grandmother's empty bedroom, standing before a large, ornate portrait of Eleanor. Clara's eyes were wide, and a strange, almost vacant expression was on her face. "Clara," Beatrice said softly, her voice filled with apprehension. "What are you doing in here?" Clara turned, but it was not Clara's eyes that met her mother's. They were filled with an old, cold fire. "I am simply admiring the decor, Beatrice. This room lacks a certain vitality." The voice was low, slow, and tinged with an age that defied Clara's youth. It was Eleanor's voice. Beatrice took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. She didn't know what to do. The daughter she knew was gone, replaced by an echo of the woman who had dominated their lives. Clara, or whatever was taking hold of her, smiled a thin, humorless smile. It was the same smile that had always preceded a particularly cruel remark from her grandmother. The smile held no warmth, only a profound, chilling sense of control. "Do not look so surprised, dear," she said, and for a moment Clara's own voice, small and pleading, seemed to struggle to break through the surface. "I am merely settling in." The sense of a presence, once a whisper, was now a roar. Clara was no longer just feeling unease, she was losing herself. The line between her own identity and her grandmother's was blurring, and with each passing day, the old woman's grip grew stronger. The question was no longer what was happening to Clara, but how much of Clara was left. The chilling finality of Eleanor's words echoed in the silent, ornate halls of Cedarwood Manor, but they were soon replaced by a different kind of sound. The desperate whispers of Clara's parents. Beatrice, with her hand still pressed to her mouth, stumbled back from her daughter's room, her face a pale mask of shock and terror. Richard, hearing her frantic cry, rushed up the sweeping staircase, his usual calm demeanor shattered. "What is it, Beatrice? What has happened?" he demanded, his eyes wide with alarm. Beatrice could only shake her head, tears welling in her eyes. It's Eleanor. She spoke to me. Through Clara." Her voice was a fragile thing, barely a breath. Richard, a man of logic and order, tried to grasp the impossibility of her words. He looked at Clara, now sitting on her bed, a peculiar, almost knowing stillness about her. He saw the shift in her posture, the unfamiliar hardness in her gaze. It was a terrifying impersonation, but he refused to believe it was anything more. "Nonsense, Beatrice. She is unwell. She's grieving. It's a nervous condition, a fit of hysteria. It happens to girls her age." His words, intended to calm, did little to soothe Beatrice's raw fear. She knew her daughter, and this was not just grief. It was something else, something deeply wrong. The next morning, they arranged a consultation with Dr. Elias Thorne, a respected physician in Boston. The drive was a silent affair, the Monroe family's carriage cloaked in a tense and heavy quiet. Clara sat between her parents, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, yet her mind seemed a world away. She was in a fog, a disorienting state of being where moments dissolved into one another without her conscious participation. She would find herself in the middle of a sentence, a stranger's words on her tongue, and a cold dread would seize her. The real Clara was a prisoner in her own mind, a silent witness to a performance she could not control. Dr. Thorne's office was a sterile, impersonal space, filled with the scent of antiseptic and old books. He was a man with a stern face and an even sterner belief in the conventional wisdom of his time. He listened to Richard and Beatrice with a patronizing tilt of his head, occasionally scribbling notes on a pad. When he finally addressed Clara, his tone was dismissive, as if she were a fragile doll, easily broken. "My dear Miss Monroe, your parents tell me you are experiencing episodes," he began, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "A common occurrence in young women of your delicate constitution. The passing of a close family member can manifest in peculiar ways. I believe this is a classic case of hysteria." He explained the diagnosis as if it were a common cold, prescribing a regimen of rest, a diet of bland foods, and a bottle of laudanum to calm her nerves. He did not ask Clara how she felt, did not probe the nature of the episodes, and did not seem to care about the chilling disconnect she felt from her own body. He was a man of science, and in his world, a woman's emotional distress was a predictable and easily managed malady. Clara wanted to scream, to tell him that it was not just a nervous condition, that she was losing herself, piece by agonizing piece. But when she opened her mouth, the words were not her own. "Your diagnosis is simplistic and insulting, doctor. My condition is far more complex than your limited understanding can comprehend." The voice was Eleanor's, sharp and disdainful. "Doctor?" Thorne's eyebrows shot up in surprise and then narrowed in displeasure. He looked from Clara to her parents, a silent accusation in his eyes. "You see?" A clear manifestation of distress. "I suggest you follow my instructions precisely. Good day." They left the office with a bottle of laudanum and a profound sense of despair. The diagnosis was a dead end. Dr. Thorne had not seen the truth. He had only seen what he expected to see. Over the next few weeks, the situation only worsened. The laudanum made Clara groggy, but did nothing to stop the episodes. The lines between Clara and Eleanor blurred to the point of near erasure. At a local tea party, Clara, in a moment of Eleanor's possession, publicly humiliated a family friend, dissecting her choice of hat and her son's poor grades with a cutting wit that was not her own. The woman fled in tears, and Clara was left standing with a bewildered, vacant expression, her mind slowly returning to the wreckage of the social scene. The invitations to social events stopped arriving. The whispers followed them wherever they went, a quiet hum of gossip about poor Clara and her fits. The family was becoming a pariah, ostracized by the very community they had helped build. Beatrice, her own health deteriorating from the constant stress, began to keep to her room, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the pervasive sadness. Richard, a man who had always taken pride in his standing in the community, became withdrawn and sullen. The weight of their daughter's condition was crushing them all. One rainy afternoon, as Clara was staring out the window, watching the drops streak across the glass, her father came into the room. He looked older, his shoulders slumped with a heavy burden. "Clara," he said, his voice a hollow echo of its former warmth. "There is something I must show you." He led her to his study, a place she rarely entered. He opened a large, locked chest, its brass fixtures tarnished with age. From within, he pulled out a stack of leather-bound journals. "Your grandmother's," he explained, his voice barely a whisper. "She kept them from the time she was a young woman. I was going through some of her papers and I found them." He handed one to Clara. The handwriting was intricate and elegant, but the words were filled with a venomous bitterness that was unmistakably Eleanor's. Clara felt a jolt of recognition, a horrifying understanding. As she read, a strange sensation washed over her. The words on the page seemed to vibrate, to hum with an unseen energy. A dizzying wave of nausea hit her, and the room began to spin. She dropped the journal, her hands flying to her head. The world tilted, and she was no longer in her father's study. She was in a different place, a memory. A grand drawing room, not unlike her own, but older, filled with the presence of a younger Eleanor, her face a mask of disappointment. The vision was so vivid it felt real. "Clara, dear, you must understand." Eleanor's voice, a ghost of a whisper, echoed in her mind. "The world will always disappoint you. You must become harder, sharper. You must become like me." Then, the vision shattered, and Clara was back in her father's study, gasping for air, a cold sweat beading on her forehead. The journals lay at her feet, a dark omen of what was to come. She looked at her father, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen before. This was not a simple fit of nerves. This was a battle for her soul. The incident with the journal was a turning point. Richard, shaken by his daughter's visceral reaction, realized that Dr. Thorne's dismissal of her condition was a grave error. His pride was no match for the terror he felt for his child. He reached out to an old family friend, a man who was as unconventional as he was brilliant, Dr. Alistair Finch. Dr. Finch was a retired physician, a man who had left the traditional medical world disillusioned with its rigid, narrow-minded views. He had spent his later years studying the burgeoning field of psychology, a practice dismissed by most of his contemporaries as little more than quackery. He had a reputation for being eccentric, but his mind was sharp, and his compassion ran deep. He arrived at Cedarwood Manor a few days later, a tall, gaunt man with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul. He spent the first few hours simply observing Clara, saying very little. He watched her as she moved through the house, noted the subtle changes in her posture, the way she would sometimes stare blankly into space before snapping back to reality with a bewildered expression. He noticed the tremor in her hands when she tried to hold a teacup and the sudden authoritative firmness that would replace it. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and gentle. "Clara, my dear," he said, addressing her directly for the first time. "I've heard much about your recent troubles. I'm not here to give you laudanum or tell you it's a simple case of hysteria. I believe what you are experiencing is very real, and I believe it has a cause." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. He was the first person to acknowledge the truth of her experience. Dr. Finch's approach was radical. He sat with Clara in her bedroom, a quiet space where she felt most at ease, and he began to ask her questions not about her symptoms, but about her life. He wanted to know about her childhood, her dreams, her fears, and most importantly, her relationship with her grandmother. "Tell me about Eleanor," he urged, his voice a soft invitation. "What was she like? What was it like to grow up under her guidance?" Clara hesitated. The memories were a minefield of conflicting emotions. Eleanor had been a formidable presence, a source of both immense pressure and a strange, cold affection. She had been the one to teach Clara how to embroider, how to play the piano, and how to carry herself in society. But she had also been a constant critic, never satisfied, always pushing for perfection. She was very particular, Clara began, her voice a fragile whisper. She wanted everything to be just so, my music, my needlework, my life. Dr. Finch nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. "And what happened when you made a mistake?" Clara's body tensed. She would disapprove, not with anger, but with a look, a silence. It was worse than a shouting. It made you feel so small. As Clara spoke, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew heavy, and a low, resonant energy seemed to fill the space. A shadow of a sneer flickered across Clara's lips. She abruptly stopped speaking, and her eyes, once soft and uncertain, hardened into a familiar, steely glare. "Dr. Finch." The voice was no longer Clara's, but Eleanor's, a low, menacing rumble. "You are meddling in affairs you do not understand. My granddaughter's mind is my own. I will not have you fill her head with such nonsense." Dr. Finch did not flinch. He met the cold gaze with a quiet intensity. "Eleanor, your time has passed. Clara needs to find her own way. She needs to be free of this." The persona's mouth twisted into a malevolent smile. "Free? Freedom is a fool's delusion. I have given her strength. A mind like yours, Dr. Finch, is too weak to understand the value of control." The conversation, a bizarre and unsettling exchange between a living man and the psychological manifestation of a dead woman, continued for several minutes. Dr. Finch calmly and logically dismantled the persona's arguments, speaking directly to the underlying trauma. He did not treat it as a ghost, but as a complex psychological symptom. Slowly, the tension in Clara's body eased. The sharp, hard look faded from her eyes, replaced by confusion and a deep weariness. She blinked, looking around the room as if waking from a dream. What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing, my dear," Dr. Finch said, his voice reassuring. "You simply needed a moment. We will continue this when you are ready." He understood that the possession was a defense mechanism, a psychological fortress built to protect Clara from the overwhelming pain of her grandmother's influence. The persona was not just an imitation. It was an ingrained part of her psyche, a part that believed it was protecting her by dominating her. Dr. Finch began a series of daily sessions, a form of proto-psychology that involved gentle probing, guided conversation, and a deep, empathetic listening. He encouraged Clara to write her thoughts down, to give voice to the feelings she had suppressed for so long. The work was slow and difficult. The grandmother persona was a formidable opponent, often emerging to disrupt the sessions with biting insults and threats. It tried to poison Clara's relationship with her parents, sowing seeds of doubt and distrust. It manifested when Clara felt vulnerable, when she was close to revealing a painful memory, or when she tried to assert her own will. One evening, as Clara was writing in a journal Dr. Finch had given her, she recalled a particularly humiliating incident from her childhood. She had been 8 years old, and she had dropped a porcelain doll, shattering it on the floor. Her grandmother, seeing the tears in her eyes, had not offered comfort. Instead, she had looked at her with that cold, disapproving stare and said, "Tears do not fix broken things, Clara. Learn to control your emotions." As the memory surfaced, a wave of cold fury, not her own, rose within her. Her hand, holding the pen, shook violently. The words she was writing, her own painful recollection, were suddenly replaced by Eleanor's firm, slanted script. The new words were a cruel mockery, telling her to stop her foolish dwelling on the past. Clara felt a profound sense of helplessness. The battle for her mind was real, and the enemy was entrenched, a part of her own being. The question was not just how to defeat it, but how to defeat a part of herself without losing what little was left. The sessions with Dr. Finch continued, an ongoing psychological skirmish in the quiet halls of Cedarwood Manor. The grandmother persona was becoming more desperate, more cunning, as it sensed its power was being challenged. It would emerge at the most inopportune times, not just with cruel words, but with physical manifestations that unnerved everyone. A teacup would suddenly be slammed down on a saucer. A chair would be scraped violently across the floor, all by Clara, yet not by her. One particularly intense evening, Dr. Finch had been pushing Clara to recall a deeper memory. "Clara, tell me about a time you felt truly free," he urged gently. The question was a direct threat to the persona. It represented everything it despised. Immediately a tension seized Clara. Her face became a mask of strained rage. A low growl emanated from her throat, and she shot to her feet, knocking her chair to the floor. "Freedom is a myth." The voice was a chilling snarl, coarse and full of a profound bitterness. "It is a word for the weak. I will not have her poisoned by such lies." Dr. Finch remained calm. He had seen this before. He knew that the persona was strongest when Clara was most vulnerable. "Why do you fear her freedom so much, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice steady. "What did you lose when you were young?" The question was a direct hit. The persona froze, its cold glare replaced by a flicker of genuine shock, a moment of unmasked pain. Before it could respond, a violent tremor racked Clara's body. She stumbled, clutching her head, as if fighting an unseen force. Then she collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. Beatrice rushed to her daughter's side, a silent scream on her lips. Richard, his face white with fear, helped Dr. Finch carry Clara to her bed. The incident left them all shaken, but it also confirmed Dr. Finch's suspicion. There was something in Eleanor's past that was the root of this torment, something she had never overcome. The next day, while Clara was resting, Dr. Finch and Richard began a meticulous search through the family archives. They went through old letters, legal documents, and journals that predated even the ones Richard had found. It was a painstaking task, a descent into the forgotten history of the Monroe family. They finally found it buried in a dusty chest in the attic. A small, unassuming journal with no name on the cover. It was Eleanor's, but from a time before she became the formidable matriarch they knew. The handwriting was different, softer, more fluid. The words were a young woman's dreams and hopes, but they soon darkened. The journal spoke of a love affair, one forbidden by her own strict, overbearing parents. A young man, a promising artist who was considered beneath the family's social standing. The letters were full of a passionate, rebellious spirit. Then abruptly, the entries changed. The handwriting became strained, the words filled with despair and resignation. The journal detailed how her family had discovered the affair. They had sent her away, had her confined to a mental sanatorium, a common punishment for rebellious young women who dared to defy social norms. The journal described the dehumanizing treatments, the forced isolation, and the chilling silence of her time there. The doctors at the sanatorium had diagnosed her with melancholia, a euphemism for a spirit they sought to break. The last entry in the journal was a profound and heartbreaking betrayal of her own identity. It read, "They have broken me. The girl who loved art and laughter is gone. I have learned my lesson. There is no joy in freedom, only pain. From now on, I will be what they want me to be. I will be hard. I will be strong. I will never allow myself to be vulnerable again. And I will never let anyone else be." Richard and Dr. Finch looked at each other, their faces grim. The chilling truth was laid bare. Eleanor wasn't just a cruel woman. She had been a victim herself, her spirit crushed by a rigid, unforgiving world. The possession of Clara wasn't a supernatural curse, but a tragic psychological inheritance. Eleanor had spent her life replicating the very cruelty that had broken her, and in death, her unresolved trauma had found a new vessel in her granddaughter, a girl who had also been raised under a suffocating weight of expectation. Dr. Finch understood the full scope of the tragedy now. Clara wasn't just fighting her grandmother, she was fighting the ghost of a broken girl, an echo of a life that had been stolen. The persona was not just a defense mechanism, it was the psychological ghost of a shattered soul, clinging to control as the only way to avoid the pain of being powerless. They knew what they had to do. The treatment had to change. They could no longer just talk. They had to confront the source of the pain, the memory of that broken girl. They had to show Clara what had been done to Eleanor, so she could understand that the path her grandmother had chosen was not a path of strength, but a path of profound, self-inflicted imprisonment. The truth was a brutal and a difficult thing, but it was also a weapon. A weapon they would have to use with great care, for they were not fighting a ghost in the traditional sense, but a psychological legacy that was as real and as dangerous as any spirit. The real horror was not in the unknown, but in the all-too-human pain passed down through generations. The discovery of Eleanor's journal was a devastating but crucial breakthrough. Richard and Beatrice, reading the faded ink and the heartbreaking words of their long-dead matriarch, felt a profound sense of sorrow and understanding. They saw Eleanor not as the cruel, domineering figure they had always known, but as a traumatized young woman whose spirit had been systematically broken. This new perspective allowed them to see Clara's condition not as a punishment, but as a tragic echo of a past trauma. With this new knowledge, Dr. Finch changed his approach. The sessions would no longer be about gentle probing, they would be about direct confrontation. He knew that to help Clara, they had to face the source of the psychological affliction head-on, the ghost of a girl Eleanor once was. He waited for Clara to be in a calm, lucid state. He sat her down in the library, the very room where her grandmother had spent so many hours ruling over the household. The air was thick with the weight of her presence. He placed the old, leather-bound journal on the mahogany table between them. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "your father and I found this. It is your grandmother's journal, not from the later years, but from when she was a young woman, not much older than you are now." Clara's eyes were filled with suspicion and confusion. "I don't understand. What is this?" she asked, her voice her own for now. Dr. Finch gently pushed the journal towards her. "Read it, Clara, all of it, from the beginning." Clara picked up the journal hesitantly. As she began to read, her expression shifted. The initial skepticism was replaced by a look of profound shock and empathy. She read about the young Eleanor's secret love, her hopes and dreams, her rebellious spirit. She read about the betrayal, the confinement, and the final crushing entry that marked the death of her true self. As she read, the air in the room grew heavy, the temperature seemed to drop. Clara's body tensed, and a shiver ran down her spine. A cold, menacing presence began to make itself known. She looked up from the journal, her eyes wide with a terror that was not entirely her own. "What is this?" The voice that came out was Eleanor's, a low, furious whisper. "Where did you get this?" "This is a lie! It is a fabrication!" Dr. Finch met the gaze without flinching. "It is the truth, Eleanor. It is the truth of what they did to you, the truth of how you were broken." The persona's rage intensified. Clara's body began to convulse, her hands flying to her ears as if to block out the words. "I am not broken. I am strong. I am in control." The voice screamed, a cacophony of fear and fury. "You are not in control." "Doctor," Finch insisted, his voice rising, now matching the intensity of the moment. "You have been a slave to that trauma your entire life, and now you are trying to make Clara a slave to it as well. You are a coward, Eleanor. You are afraid to let go of the pain because you have nothing left without it." The persona's rage boiled over. With a violent, guttural roar, Clara threw the journal across the room, where it hit the stone fireplace with a thud. She sprang to her feet, her body rigid with a malevolent energy, and lunged at Dr. Finch. Richard, who had been standing guard by the door, rushed forward and grabbed Clara, his strong arms holding her tight. She thrashed and fought, a wild, cornered animal. The sounds that came from her were not human, a mix of sobs and enraged snarls. "Clara!" Richard cried out, his voice filled with desperation. "Clara, fight it! It's not real! It's not you!" Inside her mind, Clara was in a place of utter darkness, a storm of conflicting emotions. The memories from the journal, the image of a young, heartbroken Eleanor, were warring with the persona's rage. It was a battle for her soul, a fight she had to win on her own. She was trapped in the center of a psychological tempest, caught between a shattered past and a terrifying present. She saw herself, a small, frightened girl standing on the edge of a cliff. A cold, stern figure, the embodiment of her grandmother, stood behind her, pushing. "Jump, Clara," the voice commanded. "It's the only way to be strong." But then she saw another image, a younger version of that same figure, standing on the same cliff, her face etched with a profound sadness. She was looking out at the vast empty space, a place where her dreams had been cruelly taken from her. In that moment of clarity, Clara understood. The grandmother persona wasn't trying to hurt her. It was trying to protect her, to save her from the same pain it had endured. But in doing so, it was also condemning her to a life of emotional solitude and control. With a final, desperate surge of will, Clara fought back. She pushed against the oppressive darkness, a scream of pure defiance erupting from her throat. It was her own scream, not Eleanor's. It was the sound of a girl reclaiming her mind. The effect was instantaneous. The malevolent energy that had consumed her body dissipated. She went limp in her father's arms, her eyes rolling back into her head. Richard laid her gently on the settee, her breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Finch knelt by her side, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew they had taken a massive risk, pushing her to the brink like this, but he also knew it was necessary. They had cracked the psychological shell that had encased her. The real work, the work of healing, could now begin. The confrontation had not cured her, but it had laid the groundwork for a new kind of battle. The long, arduous journey of rebuilding herself. Clara did not wake for a full day after the confrontation. When she finally did, she was weak and disoriented, as if returning from a long and difficult journey. Her parents, who had not left her side, greeted her with a tearful relief. Dr. Finch was there too, his face etched with a mix of exhaustion and hope. He sat by her bed, speaking in a low, soothing tone, explaining what had happened. He spoke not of possession, but of a psychological trauma, of a deep-seated fear that had taken root in her mind and manifested as the persona of her grandmother. He explained that she was not her grandmother, but a girl who had absorbed her grandmother's pain. Clara listened, her mind slowly piecing together the events of the last few months. The blank spaces in her memory were not so blank anymore. She could recall flashes of the episodes, the feeling of her mind being a distant observer, and the terrifying, cold control that was not her own. The knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. She finally understood what was happening to her. The sessions with Dr. Finch resumed, but the dynamic had shifted completely. The grandmother persona was still there, but it was weaker, more like an echo than a presence. It would emerge in moments of extreme stress or when Clara felt a surge of doubt, but Clara could now recognize it for what it was, a part of her, a broken part that needed to be healed. Dr. Finch's new therapy focused on rebuilding Clara's identity. He encouraged her to rediscover her own passions, her own desires, the very things that had been stifled by her grandmother's influence. He asked her to write, not in a journal of her emotions, but in a journal of her dreams, her hopes, and her own opinions. Clara began to explore her artistic side, a part of her that had been suppressed. She started painting, her hands covered in vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the grim, muted tones of the manor. The act of creation was an act of rebellion, a quiet assertion of her own will. Each brushstroke was a step away from the person she was forced to be, and a step towards the person she wanted to be. Her parents were instrumental in her healing. Beatrice, her own fear replaced by a fierce determination, became her greatest ally. She would sit with Clara for hours, her needlework forgotten, listening to her daughter talk about her feelings, her fears, and her progress. Richard, a man who had always been emotionally reserved, started to open up, sharing his own grief and his own fears about losing her. Their support was a foundation upon which Clara could rebuild her fractured sense of self. But the road to recovery was not without its pitfalls. There were days when the despair was overwhelming, when the voice of her grandmother was a constant nagging whisper in her mind. "You are weak, Clara. You will fail. You will never be free." On one such day, she had been painting a vibrant, chaotic landscape. Her hands, covered in paint, were trembling. The voice in her head was relentless. "This is a waste of time. Your art is childish. You will never be a proper lady." Clara stopped, her brush hovering over the canvas. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not her own face, but the disapproving sneer of her grandmother. She felt the familiar pull, the sense of being dragged back into the psychological abyss. But this time something was different. She had the tools to fight back. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered the journal, the story of the heartbroken girl who had lost her dreams. She remembered the pain, the betrayal, and the final crushing resignation. And in that moment, her empathy for the ghost of that girl was stronger than her fear. She opened her eyes, looked at her reflection, and spoke, not to herself, but to the memory of her grandmother. "You didn't fail, Eleanor. You were broken, and I will not let your pain break me too." The reflection seemed to waver, to become less solid. The sneer softened, a flicker of something close to sorrow in its eyes. Then, it was gone. Clara picked up her brush and continued to paint, her hand now steady. The colors on the canvas seemed to sing with a new energy, a new life. She was still in a fight, but she was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, armed with the truth and the unwavering support of her family. The long, arduous journey of healing was underway. It was not a magical cure, but a slow and difficult process of confronting the deepest parts of her trauma, of forgiving a woman who had never forgiven herself, and of learning to love the person she was meant to be. The real victory was not just in driving out the possession, but in discovering her own strength and her own identity. The progress was undeniable. Clara was visibly healthier, her eyes brighter, her spirit more resilient. The episodes of the possession had become rare and short-lived, more like the brief angry outbursts of a trapped animal than a full-scale takeover. She was a fighter now, no longer a victim. She was actively pushing back against the psychological weight of her grandmother's legacy. Dr. Finch, however, knew that the fight was not yet over. The final and most difficult step was to have Clara confront the source of her grandmother's original trauma. They had to go to the heart of the matter, to the place where the young Eleanor's spirit had been broken. It was a risky move, but he believed it was the only way to sever the final psychological ties. They planned a trip to the old sanatorium where Eleanor had been confined. The place was long abandoned, a desolate, decaying ruin on the outskirts of Boston. The building stood as a monument to a cruel and unforgiving era. Richard was vehemently against the idea, fearing the psychological toll it would take on his daughter. But Clara, with a fierce, newfound determination, insisted. "I need to do this," she said, her voice steady. "I need to see it with my own eyes. I need to face her there." The trip was a somber affair. The air in the carriage was thick with a nervous tension. As they approached the sanatorium, a low, menacing energy seemed to emanate from the old building. The windows were shattered, the paint was peeling, and a profound, silent dread hung in the air. As Clara stepped out of the carriage, she felt a familiar tremor. It was the possession trying to reassert itself, a final, desperate gasp of a dying force. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pushed back. "You have no power here," she thought, a defiant mantra. "This is my battle." They entered the sanatorium, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty halls. The building was a labyrinth of cold, sterile rooms. The air was frigid, the silence oppressive. Clara's body was on high alert, her mind fighting against the psychological assault. The voice in her head was a cacophony of fear and rage, a symphony of her grandmother's pain. "Go back," it screamed. "This is not for you. This is my pain, my shame." They found their way to the room where Eleanor had been kept. It was a small, grimy cell with a single barred window. On the wall, faded and almost invisible, were scratch marks, a testament to a long-ago rage and desperation. Clara stood in the center of the room, her body trembling. She felt the full weight of her grandmother's suffering. She felt the pain, the betrayal, the loneliness. She felt the moment a young girl's heart was shattered. Then she felt the possession surge for the final time. It was a psychological phantom, a last-ditch effort to stop her. The voice was a thunderous roar in her mind. "You will not let this be. This is my legacy. This is what made me strong." Clara fell to her knees, her hands pressed to her head. The physical and emotional pain was overwhelming. She was at a breaking point, the psychological strain threatening to tear her mind apart. But then, in the midst of the psychological storm, she remembered something Dr. Finch had told her. "Your grandmother's greatest strength was not her control, Clara. It was her resilience. She survived this place. She found a way to go on. That is the part of her you must embrace, not the part that tried to make you a prisoner." With a final, desperate surge of will, Clara screamed. But it was not a scream of terror, it was a scream of release. She screamed for the girl who had been broken, for the life that had been stolen. She screamed for the pain, the loneliness, the endless sorrow. She screamed for Eleanor, and in doing so she screamed for herself. The scream was a physical thing. It seemed to shatter the cold, oppressive silence of the room. And as it faded, so too did the presence. The psychological force that had consumed her for months, the ghost of a broken girl, was finally, irrevocably gone. Clara collapsed onto the cold, dusty floor, her body spent, her mind finally blissfully quiet. She lay there for a long time, the silence a balm to her battered soul. She felt a profound sense of emptiness, but it was not the emptiness of a broken girl. It was the emptiness of a vessel that had been cleansed, of a space that was now hers to fill. She got up, her legs wobbly but strong. She walked to the window and looked out at the world outside. The sun, a rare presence on that gloomy day, broke through the clouds, casting a golden light on the broken building. The view was beautiful, and for the first time in a very long time, Clara Monroe looked out at the world with her own eyes. The return journey to Cedarwood Manor was a world away from the tense, fraught drive to the sanatorium. The air in the carriage was light, filled with a quiet sense of triumph and relief. Clara, exhausted but at peace, slept soundly for most of the trip, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. Beatrice and Richard held hands, their faces a mixture of gratitude and profound, tearful joy. Their daughter, their real daughter, was back. The next few weeks were a period of recovery and rediscovery. The silence in the house, once a source of deep unease, was now a welcome and comforting presence. It was no longer the silence of a house under a psychological siege, but the quiet of a home that was finally at peace. Dr. Finch continued his visits, but the sessions were no longer about confronting a psychological entity. They were about rebuilding. He helped Clara understand that the possession was a manifestation of her own deep-seated anxieties and fears, a way for her mind to process her grief and the immense pressure she had felt under her grandmother's influence. The persona was not a separate entity, but a part of her, a broken part that she had to integrate and heal. Clara, in turn, began to fill the quiet spaces in her life with her own passions. She spent hours in her art studio, a small, sunlit room she had claimed for her own. Her canvases, once a defiant act of rebellion, were now a celebration of her newfound freedom. She painted vibrant landscapes, portraits of her loving parents, and self-portraits that reflected a spirit that was both bruised and beautiful. The colors were her voice, the brushstrokes her song. Her relationship with her parents was reborn. The forced social distance that had been imposed by her condition was gone, replaced by a profound and honest closeness. She could talk to her mother about her fears, and to her father about her dreams. The old, cold formality of the Monroe family was replaced by a warm, loving atmosphere that had been missing for years. Clara's healing was not just emotional, it was physical. The pallor on her face was replaced by a healthy glow. The constant tremor in her hands was gone. Her posture, once stiff and rigid, was now relaxed and confident. She moved through the world with a new sense of purpose, her head held high. The community, having witnessed the Monroe family's quiet struggle, began to slowly reach out. The invitations to social events began to trickle back in. But this time, Clara did not feel the crushing pressure to conform to their expectations. She attended the events on her own terms, a quiet, confident presence. When a woman tried to gossip about her fits, Clara simply looked her in the eye and said with a quiet authority that was entirely her own, "I was unwell. I am better now." The answer was simple, honest, and it left no room for further speculation. The social whispers faded into silence. The only remaining task was to address the source of her grandmother's trauma. Clara, with the help of Dr. Finch, decided to write a final letter, not to her grandmother, but to the ghost of the girl she once was. She sat at her desk, her pen hovering over a clean sheet of paper. The words came slowly at first, But soon they flowed, a testament to her healing. She wrote about the journal, about the pain she felt for her grandmother's lost dreams, and about the legacy of control that had been passed down. She ended the letter with a promise to herself and to the memory of her grandmother. "I will not be you, Eleanor. I will not let the pain make me cruel. I will not let the world break me. But I will not forget you. I will honor the strength that allowed you to survive, and I will find a way to make the beauty and the light that was once within you a part of my own life. I will live the life you were never allowed to have. I will be free." She folded the letter, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in a small box. She would keep it, a permanent reminder of the long, arduous journey she had taken, a testament to her own resilience and to the profound human tragedy that had shaped her family. Clara Monroe was no longer the girl who was possessed by her grandmother's spirit. She was just Clara Monroe, a young woman who had walked through a psychological hell and had emerged on the other side, not unscathed but whole. Her story was not one of magic or ghosts, but of a young woman who had faced her deepest fears and had found her own strength in the process. The horror was not supernatural, it was simply human, and the triumph was all the more powerful because of it. The months that followed were a testament to Clara's healing. The oppressive weight of her grandmother's legacy had lifted, and in its place, a new, vibrant energy filled Cedarwood Manor. The house, once a monument to an unforgiving past, was now a home filled with laughter and light. Clara's art was flourishing. She held a small, private exhibition in the drawing room, inviting only a few close friends and family members. Her paintings, full of rich colors and emotional depth, were a revelation. They were not just beautiful, they were a story, a chronicle of her journey from darkness to light. She painted a self-portrait, but instead of the grim, stern face of her past, the canvas showed a young woman with a quiet, knowing smile, her eyes filled with a profound and hard-won peace. She painted a portrait of her parents, capturing the love and the worry that had defined their faces for so long. She even painted a portrait of her grandmother, but it was not the domineering matriarch she had once known. It was a dual image, one side showing the stern, older woman, and the other, a ghostly, fragile image of the young girl from the journal, her eyes filled with a profound and heartbreaking sadness. The painting was a masterpiece of empathy and understanding, a final act of forgiveness. The art brought her a quiet but significant recognition. A local newspaper wrote a small article about her, praising her unique style and her emotional depth. She was not a proper lady anymore. She was an artist, and she was happy. Her relationship with her parents continued to deepen. The shared trauma had brought them closer than ever before. They spent their evenings in the library, not in silent despair, but in lively conversation. Richard would read aloud from his favorite authors, and Beatrice would share her own quiet observations about the world. They talked about the past, not with regret, but with a new understanding. They talked about Eleanor, about the tragedy of her life, and about the legacy of pain she had left behind. "She was a product of her time, I suppose," Richard said one evening, his voice filled with a quiet sorrow. "Her family, they broke her, and she never had the chance to heal." Clara nodded, her eyes on the portrait she had painted. "She was afraid," she said. "She was afraid of being weak. But in the end, her fear was what made her a prisoner. She was so afraid of being vulnerable that she ended up being alone." The healing was not just Clara's alone. Richard and Beatrice, in the process of helping their daughter, had also healed their own wounds. The weight of living under Eleanor's shadow had been a burden they had carried for years, a psychological pressure that had defined their lives. Now that pressure was gone. They could finally be themselves. Dr. Finch, now more of a cherished family friend than a physician, visited often. He and Clara would spend hours discussing the new and radical field of psychology. Clara, with her own lived experience, had a deep and intuitive understanding of the human mind. She became a student of the craft, fascinated by the way the mind worked, by the way trauma could manifest itself, and by the power of empathy and understanding to heal the deepest wounds. One day, while looking through her grandmother's old things, she found a small, locked chest she had never seen before. Inside, she found a letter addressed to her father. It was written in Eleanor's later years, in a shaky, almost illegible hand. The letter was short and to the point. It was an apology, a confession. Eleanor wrote about her own past, about the trauma she had suffered, and about the deep and profound regret she felt for the way she had treated her family. "I did not know how to love without being in control," she wrote. "I did not know how to be a mother without being a tyrant. I am so sorry, Richard. I am so sorry for the person I became. Forgive me." Clara and her father read the letter together, their eyes filled with tears. It was a final gift from a woman who had been broken, a final act of humanity that had been hidden for so long. The letter was a testament to the idea that even the most seemingly cruel and unforgiving people could have a deep and profound sense of regret. It was a final piece of the puzzle, a final act of closure. The legacy of Cedarwood Manor was no longer one of fear and control. It was one of understanding and forgiveness. Clara Monroe, the girl who was almost consumed by a psychological ghost, had not just survived. She had flourished. She had taken a story of trauma and pain and had turned it into a story of resilience and hope. Her journey was not just a personal one. It was a journey of a family, a journey of a generation finally breaking free from the psychological chains of the past. The years passed, and Clara Monroe became a different kind of woman than her grandmother had ever intended. The world of 1881, with its rigid social norms and its narrow view of what a woman could be, was slowly giving way to a new era, one of change and possibility. Clara was at the forefront of that change, a quiet but formidable force in her own right. She never forgot the past. The events of those dark months remained a part of her, not as a source of terror, but as a testament to her own strength. She continued her art, her paintings becoming more popular and more profound. She used her work not just as a means of expression, but as a way to tell stories of human resilience, of the psychological struggles that so many people faced in silence. Her art was a quiet rebellion, a powerful act of empathy. She married a kind and gentle man, a man who loved her for who she was, not for who she was supposed to be. He was a scientist, a man of logic and reason, but he had a deep and profound respect for the complexities of the human spirit. They had children, and Clara was a loving and attentive mother, a stark contrast to the distant and controlling figure her own grandmother had been. She taught her children to be kind, to be vulnerable, and to understand that it was okay to be afraid. She taught them that emotions were not a weakness, but a guide. The manor, once a place of shadows, became a home of warmth and life. The portraits of Eleanor, once a constant, watchful presence, were taken down and stored away. Clara replaced them with her own paintings, her own art, her own story. The house was no longer a museum to a painful past, but a canvas for a bright and hopeful future. Dr. Finch, her wise and gentle mentor, remained a close friend until his death. He was a pioneer in his field, a man who saw the truth in a world that was too afraid to look. Clara, in her own way, carried on his legacy. She used her art, her words, and her own quiet strength to advocate for a deeper understanding of the human mind, to challenge the old, dismissive diagnoses of hysteria, and to show people that their pain, no matter how strange, was real and could be healed. Clara's story was not a tale of a girl saved by magic or a miraculous cure. It was the story of a girl who was saved by the courage of her own heart and the unwavering support of her family. It was a story about the devastating power of human trauma and the equally powerful, and perhaps even more profound, power of human connection, empathy, and resilience. The final act of her journey was not a dramatic one, but a simple, peaceful one. She stood in the drawing room of Cedarwood Manor, now a wise and content woman. The room was filled with the light of a spring afternoon, the sound of her grandchildren's laughter echoing through the halls. She looked at her hands, no longer trembling with a ghost's energy, but strong and steady. She remembered the fear, the confusion, and the pain. But she also remembered the moments of clarity, the love of her parents, and the quiet, determined voice in her head that said, "Fight." And she knew, with a certainty that ran bone deep, that she had won. The battle was over. The ghost of her grandmother's trauma was finally, irrevocably at rest. And in its place, a new legacy had been born, one of healing, hope, and a deep, abiding peace.